Hello everyone, I welcome you all for the 5 editorials of the week series. So in this initiative, we will be picking the 5 important and most relevant editorial which came in this Hindu in the past 1 week, and we will be discussing with respect to the mains point of view. And today I have picked the 5 editorials. Let us go into the video. The first editorial is about the nuclear deterrence. So the author discusses about how we have to bring back the nuclear deterrence and the nuclear awareness. The second is about the facets of India's secularism and how to revive the India's secularism in the modern times. And the third one is about the population data and the demographics and the trend of the fertility rates. And the fourth editorial is about the critical analysis of Project Tiger over the period of time. And the last one is about the self-reliant, that is Atmanirbhar foreign policy. So let us go into the video. So the first article for the day is bringing nuclear risk back to the popular imagination. So this article is written by Manpreet Sethi. Manpreet Sethi is a researcher in Center for Air Power Studies, and she is an expert in airborne weaponologies also. So this article is relevant in GS paper 3 because GS paper 3 has the portion called internal security, and in the internal security we are having the word called role of external state actors in creating internal security problem. We are always having the risk of nuclear attack from Pakistan and China. They are external state actors, so it is relevant to our GS3 paper internal security. So let us go into the article. In this article, what she is mentioning is that earlier we had awareness about the nuclear weapon in the Cold War era, and in the present era people are having some public apathy with respect to nuclear weapons. That is, people are not concerned much about nations having nuclear weapons, and they are not talking that in their political discourse. And at the same time, the political complacency, that is the political class, the leaders of the nations and the international organization and multilateral institutions also are not aiming at reduction of nuclear weapons or curbing it. So there is a public apathy and political complacency with respect to nuclear weapons, and we have to bring it down. We have to create awareness about the horrors of the nuclear weapon, is what she is talking in this article. First point to be noted in this article is that she talks about the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Since August 5 and 9 or the 75th anniversary of the nuclear attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, she talks about the how badly the two cities suffered, and she brings back the imaginary. So from this, what we can notice, almost 3 lakh people died. 1.5 lakh people died because of the immediate blast, and another 1.5 people died because of the after effects of the nuclear attack. So that is one thing which she is noting. Another thing which you have to notice, those people who survived the attack. So those people who survived this nuclear attack with injuries and with various after effects and side effects all through the slides are called as hibakusha. Still a few hibakushas are there. In preliminary, they can also ask this. The term hibakusha is seen in news is related to what? So hibakusha are the survivors of the nuclear attack in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who are undergoing pain every day because of the after effects, like in the form of skin allergies or skin cancers or all those things. And she talks about how badly the Hiroshima and Nagasaki was affected, and she's starting the article with that. And we are celebrating 75th anniversary now. At the 75th anniversary, what we have to think? So that is what this article is. What she is talking at present, there are almost 9 nations are having nuclear weapons at present, and their nuclear arsenal is so large. If at all any nation uses the nuclear weapons against, the damage could be very severe than when compared to what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is what she is warning, and she is also talking that in the present day, the nuclear attack will not be premeditated. 1945 nuclear attack on Japan was a premeditated, planned attack, but such kind of a premeditated planned attack is not possible today because nations believe in this concept called deterrence. If a nation attacks another nation with a nuclear weapon, they will retaliate back with their nuclear weapon. So that retaliation will cause a huge damage to the nation who started the war, and that's why they will not do the first strike with a nuclear weapon. So that is the concept of deterrence. Hence, since there is no possibility of premeditated attack, what she is telling is that there is every likelihood of a miscalculation or misperception, or by mistake some persons can detonate it. So such kind of miscalculation should be addressed and it should be stopped now. So that is what she is mentioning in her. So why there is this possibility of unintended use? How this concept of miscalculation is increasing is that because of the trust deficit. In the present day world, there is a huge trust deficit between many nations, and there is a huge tensions going on, like between USA and China. There is a new trust deficit, and USA and Russia, we all know that. And also increasing cyber attacks on nuclear command. So we are seeing in recent time a lot of cyber attacks are increasing. What if a few terrorists hack the Indian nuclear command or any other country's nuclear command, and they trigger the nuclear weapon? So what happens, like what will happen if there is a hacking of the India's nuclear capabilities? Recently also we saw that our Kalpakam atomic power plant also database and the computers also were also hacked. So if that is the threat, the cyber attack is posing a new kind of threat for this unintended use. At the same time, there is an increasing use of hypersonic missiles. This hypersonic missile with high maneuverability, they can quickly go and attack another nation. So increasing hypersonic missile and artificial intelligence. This rise of artificial intelligence also can pose a huge threat, because in such a scenario of uncertainty, we are always having this threat of unintended use of nuclear weapons. And in the Cold War era, see, we are having nuclear weapons for the past 75 years, but why the threat has increased now? Because in Cold War era, we knew that two very big nuclear powered nations, USA and USSR, were in conflict. So when these two nations who are capable of creating a nuclear war, were in a constant conflict, people were aware of after effects. People were constantly driven into drills, what to do with respect to a nuclear attack, where to go and hide. All those things were used to go, and this TV, media, and documentaries always depicted the after effect of the how the nuclear attack will be impacting the nature, impacting the soil, impacting the water availability, impacting the human health, all those things, which created the awareness and also instilled the constant fear among the people's mind. Since there was a constant fear among the people's mind with respect to nuclear attacks, they always didn't want this nuclear war to happen, and that led to the resistance to keep alive. That led people to go and create a political movement to stop the use of nuclear attack. Like what she is mentioning, there was this, since the public were always aware of what is the after effect of the nuclear attack during the Cold War era, there was a constant public pressure, and the civil society movement. The civil society movement with the NGOs and all those things, they were always pressing and giving a political pressure to the government to stop and control the use of nuclear weapons. At the same time, that led to various multilateral treaties. Even the USA and USSR also signed a treaty called START, that is Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and we also had this SALT treaties, where they aimed to control the nuclear weapons. So such kind of public pressure in the Cold War era led to such treaties. But what is happening in present? Ever since the Cold War got ended, there were no two nations who are in the constant conflict, and that's why the public pressure and the public consciousness regarding the threat of the nuclear weapons deteriorated. This deterioration led to fall in that civil society movement and the pressure on the political class to control the nuclear weapons, and hence that created the public apathy and political complacency with respect to nuclear weapons. So what the author finally is telling is that at this time, on the 75th year of this Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world, various international institutions and nations and civil society organizations should start this campaign to create the awareness about the harmful effects of the nuclear weapons, and they have to bring back that fear in the minds of people and consciousness about the nuclear attacks in the mind of people, that leads to the various political pressure and multilateral treaty. So we have to bring back all those things now by using the 75th anniversary as a start. So this is what the author is telling at the end of the article. Second editorial which we are going to see is about the future of Indian secularism. See, the secularism, this editorial is written by Raju Bhargava. Raju Bhargava is a sociologist, so he writes a lot of articles with respect to sociology. So sociology optional students, please follow his articles. Almost every week he writes one article at least. So follow his article for sociology preparation. This article is about the present status of India's secularism. This secularism plays a very important role in our GS1 syllabus. In GS1 we are having this word secularism is directly mentioned, so it is there in syllabus. And also, if you could see in previous year questions from 2017 onwards, UPSC is being asking questions from secularism. Like in 2017 the question was between the differences between the religiousness and religiosity. In 2018 there was a question which asked how the Indian secularism differs from the Western form of secularism, and in 2019 question was a very controversial question. How in the name of secularism the cultural values of India is under threat. Everyone criticized even the question and intention of the question. So that is how the UPSC is treating the secularism. Every year it is asking at least one question from secularism. So if that is the case, we have to give importance to this article also. This article is very important because in recent times what we are seeing is we are seeing a trend that the secularism of India is declining. So that is what is being observed. That's why even UPSC is asking. So what he is telling, these recent instances might give feel that some might think that the secularism of India is completely eradicated, but that is not true. It is just a temporary setback and we can revive it. So he is discussing how India's secularism transformed from constitutional secularism to party political secularism, and how this party political secularism has led to majoritarian secularism. So this, how we have to reverse this majoritarian secularism and revive back the constitutional secularism of India. How we can revive the true values of secularism in India is only what he is discussing. He is also giving the way forward. The first issue, the first one, he is starting the article by differentiating between the constitutional secularism and party political secularism. So India's secularism's evolution from 1947 can be divided into two phases, that is constitutional secularism and party political secularism. So constitutional secularism means it is a secularism which came directly from the ethos mentioned in the constitution, that is the various ideals of the constitution given in the fundamental rights, especially between article 25 to 28, all those things gave this constitutional secularism. In general, if you could see in the entire world, the secularism means it is total cut off of the politics from religion. There will not be any interference of the state or the government in the religion. So that is how the Western secularism means, which is negative secularism. Indian form of secularism is a positive secularism, where we respect all the religions and we also interfere in the religious affairs. So when we will interfere in the religious affairs, for that only this term he is mentioning. India's constitutional secularism is based on critical respect for all the religions with principled distance. Okay, this is the exact terminology which we can use to describe the India's secularism. Critical respect for all religion with principled distance. So here respect for all religions means we are respecting each and every religion and we are not giving priority to any single religion. So respect for all religions means we are giving respect to all religion, we are not giving priority to single religion. The word critical mean, what is the meaning of the word critical? The meaning of the word critical means we will be having a principled distance, that is between the religion and the state there will be a distance. In Western form there will be a hard barrier between the both state and the religion. So this is Western secularism. There is a harsh barrier between them, they will not interfere. But in India, the state here means government and religion is not having this barrier, but there is a principled distance. Whenever state want, they can interfere. So when they can interfere, it is critical. So whenever the constitutional values or any unconstitutional thing is being done in the name of religion, then state can interfere. In article 25 also they would have given the exemptions when the article 25 can be taken. So it is critical respect, that is we will respect all the religions, but if there is any problem in your religion which is against the values given in the constitution, then we will interfere. So that is what the principled distance means. To describe this, Ambedkar also famously given a quote. So the Ambedkar quotes read like this: every aspect of religious doctrine or practice cannot be respected. Respect for religion must be accompanied by critique. So every aspect of religion cannot be accepted, because religion asks what? Religion has caste system, religion oppresses the women. So there are many elements in the various religions which should be checked. Okay, we have to intervene when the religious groups promote communal disharmony. Whenever the religious group is promoting communal disharmony in the name of article 25, then state can intervene and critique. And then discrimination or oppress its own members. When one religion is discriminating or oppressing its own members, like for example we are having this caste system where people from the suppressed caste are being ill-treated by the people of the dominant caste. So that is one thing. Another thing where each and every religion discriminates women. So women are being equally discriminated in all religions. So whenever this gender equality or the discrimination comes in within the religion, there the state will intervene, because these are affecting the values given in the constitution, that is liberty, equality and fraternity. So what it is telling, the principal distance means the state will be constantly engaging. So we are having state here and we are having religion here. State will be constantly either engaging or disengaging. So when to engage and when to disengage is the option which the state should take. So that decision is taken based on whenever the liberty, equality and fraternity, this constitution values are threatened. Or article 25 also gives another thing called morality and health. So whenever this morality or health or in terms of liberty, equality, fraternity are threatened because of any religion, then state will engage. If the other aspects of religion, it will disengage. So this is what is called as critical respect for all religion with principled distance, and this is the constitutional secularism which we were following till 90s. So for this constitutional secularism to stay, what we need an impartial judiciary. only if there is an impartial judiciary and a scrupulous media. Scrupulous media means honest media, which is very sincere media, and then a proper civil society and alert citizenry. So civil society means NGOs and all these things. Only if these four pillars are working together, we can ensure this constitutional secularism. Okay, so what the author is telling, from 1947 onwards, we were following this constitutional secularism. But ever since 1970s, this constitutional secularism slowly turned into party political secularism. Okay, this party political secularism after the 21st century, it is slowly turning into majoritarian secularism. So he is discussing this shift in the evolution of secularism over the period of 75 years, and he is talking how to revert the setbacks of majoritarian secularism and take back to constitutional secularism. For that also he is giving the steps in this article. So we can also note down this timeline, and we can also draw this whenever there is a question regarding secularism in the examination. So what is party political secularism? In party political secularism, the principled distance which we discussed above is slowly getting converted into opportunistic distance. Opportunistic distance means a political party or a or state or government is having a engagement with the religion not with respect to constitutional values in mind. Instead, it is engaging with respect electoral gains in mind. Just for electoral gains, they will be keeping an alliance. So such kind of a thing is emerging recently. One such instance is that so this critical respect is slowly turning into appeasement. Instead of criticizing the religion whenever it wanted, instead of maintaining this critical respect, these political parties ever since 1970s went into the appeasement. So what is this appeasement? We can take this example of 1985 Shah Banu case. In Shah Banu case, what is happening? Supreme Court is adjudicating that Muslim women who are all getting divorced, that is Shah Banu was divorced, and she should be getting all the benefits as given by the general divorce law of the nation instead of following the Muslim personal law. That is, in Muslim personal law prohibits the Muslim women from all the benefits like alimony or the maintenance fees, all those things. So that's why instead of following the Muslim personal law, if the woman wants, she can also follow the general divorce law. So that is what the Shah Banu case did. But since there was an outreach from the conservative elements of the society, what the then government did, instead of supporting this judgment, they just passed an act called Muslim Women Protection Act. This Muslim Women Protection Act was passed just to reverse the judgment whichever is done, and they said that even in the Muslim divorce, only Muslim laws will be followed and not the general divorce law. So they reversed this judgment. Instead of supporting this judgment, which is a reform which tries to protect the woman from oppression of its own member, what it did, it just with the electoral gains in mind with respect to appeasement of one religious community, that then government followed this Muslim Women Protection Act, and all religion is becoming majority religion. We had this word called critical respect for all religion. Now this all word is being replaced by majority religion. Principal distance between what? It became opportunistic distance. Critical respect became appeasement. So appeasement for majority religion with opportunistic distance is only now being followed by the latest form of majoritarian secularism. In the recent time, what is happening? This appeasement led to the majority-minority debate. That is, one majority religion oppressing one minority religion. Such kind of a debate is emerging in India. So this majority-minority conflict is emerging, and the political parties at the present times are standing in favor of majority religion, and they are doing all their engagement with majority religion and demonizing all the minority religion. That is what is actually taking place. That is what the author is mentioning as majoritarianism masquerading as secularism. So in the name of secularism, the political parties now are following the majoritarianism. That is, they are supporting the majority parties and leaving alone the minority community. So now, how we can revive our secularism from majoritarian secularism, and how we can take it back to constitutional secularism. So that is also author is giving. So this recent majoritarian secularism has opened this dialogue of majority-minority dichotomy. Whenever there is a conflict emerging between the majority and minority religion, people belonging to the entire majority religion, there are many differences and problems within it. In minority religion also, there are many differences among the people, and there is problems within them. But when this conflict arising and it is getting strengthening, what is happening? People in the majority religion are forgetting the issues within their religion. They all are coming together in order to oppress the minority religion. When minority religion, what is happening? People are forgetting all the issues within their religion. They are all coming together just to oppose the majority religion. So when this kind of majority-minority dichotomy comes, what is happening? The internal reforms within the religion is getting a sidestep. So people are neglecting the internal reforms within the religion. So that is not a good trend. only if this internal reforms is being mentioned in our constitutional secularism in the form of critical respect. But this critical respect is slowly going because of this majority minority dichotomy. So now what we have to do, how we can revive, means we have to create a social movement. The author is telling that we have to create a social movement where people revive secularism and social justice. We have to shift the emphasis from the inter-religious conflict to intra-religious issues. Now majority and minority religions are in the conflict now. Instead of solving this conflict between them, we have to pause this and we have to use this opportunity to again go back to the issues within the minority religion and solve it, and again we have to go back to the issues within the majority religion and solve it. Okay, so by solving the issues within the religion, that will lead to a good form of secularism. That is what the author is mentioning in the article. So this is one of the way forward which is suggesting. There should be a social movement which focuses on intra-religious issues instead of going into the inter-religious issues. So we can note it down and we can write whenever the question is being asked. Only if this internal reforms in the religion takes place, the religion will be reformed, and that will lead to future social harmony. So that is another thing which the author mentions. Now again, another way forward which he is telling is going beyond toleration. So our secularism was built based on tolerating. Everyone should tolerate all the religions. So toleration was the basic principle of secularism of India earlier. Now we have to go beyond toleration. He is suggesting one technique is that which is called as socio-religious reciprocity. That is creating a reciprocity between the majority religion and minority religion. That is, majority religion should be dependent on minority religion for certain things. Minority religion should be dependent on majority religion for certain things. When they both are dependent on each other, whenever this conflict arises between them, they will try to avoid the conflict because they are dependent on them. When majority is dependent on minority, they will not allow to raise this conflict. So now see this example. Now we are having India and Pakistan at one side and India and China on other side. Now China recently did a few border skirmishes and created a lot of problem in border. If the same thing Pakistan has done, means what India would have done? India would have done surgical strikes and they would have escalated the entire issue to the international level and they would have made it huge, because we are not having good relationship with Pakistan, but we are having a strong economic ties with China. Since we are having strong economic ties with China, China wants India and India wants China. So that is the situation now. Because of this, even though there is a very big issue in the border, we are not escalating it. Instead, we are trying to solve the issue with the dialogue. We are trying to solve the issue with the dialogue instead of escalating it into a higher level. So because this economic relationship will prevent the enmity between the two. The same thing can be applied here. We have to create this reciprocity between the majority and minority religion, and they should be dependent on each other for everyday aspects. So that is one thing. Next, we have to remove the political alienation. Because of this majority minority dichotomy, what is happening? There is the alienation among the two. That is, if you take a city, means majority people are living in one region and minority people are living in a separate area. So they live in a separate region, a separate area which will be dominated by minority community. So this is called as ghettos. So there is this ghettoization of minority community. They are being alienated in every city and they are living alone instead of intermingling with the rest of the society. So this alienation is happening because of this majority minority conflict, and wherever the communalism is happening, minority people are just living in a separate colonies. So such things should be removed, and we should bring them back to the mainstream society, and we should allow the intermingling. So that is another thing to revive back the secularism. And the third thing which the author is talking is about bridging the democratic deficit. In the recent time, if you could note, democratic values are being eroded. That is what the perception the people are having. People in the minority religions are questioning the relevance of democracy, and they are losing the trust on democracy because of the majoritarianism. So what we have to do, we have to bridge the democratic deficit, and we have to provide confidence among the minority religion people with respect to the democracy. So that is what the author is mentioning. If these three happens, automatically we can ensure the harmony between the majority and minority religion, and we can alleviate the communalism. So that is what the author is finally concluding. So note down all the points here, note down all the keywords, because we discussed a lot of keywords, like for example democratic deficit, socio-religious reciprocity, alienation of citizens, so majority minority dichotomy. So these kind of keywords we are using. So you have to use these kind of keywords in your answers. And at the same time, if you could note another thing, we didn't mention any political party's name, we didn't mention any individual's name. Instead of without mentioning, we addressed all the issues. Like that only our main answer should be. Without mentioning the political parties or taking sides on one side, we have to write the answer without taking any political sides. So that is what you have to note from this editorial. So next article is about India's population data and tale of two projection. So population, so this article is written by Sonali Desai. Sonali Desai is a sociology professor again, and this article is about population, and population comes under GS1. In GS1 we are having this topic called population and associated issues. So it is directly related to a topic in GS1, and so we have to study any issues related to India's population and demography. So what she is telling in this article is that India's demographic future will be peaking. That is, India's population, we are already in 1.3 billion. This 1.3 billion population will be peaking in 2050. Okay, after 2050 it will be falling. So that is what it is. That is what she is telling. After 2050 it will be falling. And how we have to, so this is the demographic pattern of India's future. With this demographic pattern of India's future, how we have to plan for the future. That is what she is discussing. When she is discussing, she is also talking about how India's fertility rate changed over the period of time. So this is very important with respect to the mains point of view, and we'll discuss the various reasons for how the fertility rate in India changed. Fertility rate means number of children a woman can bear within her reproductive age. How many children a woman is having on an average in India. That is the fertility rate. So let us see the article. So in her article, she is starting with two projections. That is, one projection of India's population by Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, and other is about United Nations population projection. So both these metrics show the projection of India's population, but there is a slight difference on how these both graphs are behaving after 2050. Till 2050 they both are peaking, but after 2050 the Institute of Health Metrics, that is IHME's graph, points that India's population will fall to as low as 1 billion or 724 million. It will fall below 1 billion. But what the UN projection is telling is that even into 2100 our population will be at 1.4 billion. So UN projection is telling that India's population will peak at 1.6 billion in 2050, and then it will fall to 1.4 billion, which is higher than what we are having 1.3 billion now. But what IHME is telling is that it will peak at 1.4 billion in 2050 and it will fall to 1.1 billion, which is very lesser than the present numbers. So Nutipati Kodi. So it will fall to 110 crore is what the graph is telling. So these are all the two projections of India's population, but they are all just the graphical projection, and we cannot assure which is going to happen. But one thing for sure will happen, that is this pattern will happen for sure. That is, our population will peak in 2050 and it will fall. So United Nations is telling that it will be like this, and IHME is telling that it will go like this. So that is what the difference these both graphs are telling. But one thing which is common is both are falling. So with the both are falling later, how we have to plan the future, that is what this article is dealing about. So if you could note, now she is discussing about India's evolution of India's fertility rate. So how this fertility rate was there in 1950. In 1950, each woman had 6 children. The average was 6, and in 2020 the fertility rate is 2.2. So there is a tremendous fall in fertility rate from 6 to 2.2 over the period of 75 years. So that is what 70 years, that is what the observation is. We can divide this 1950 to 2020 into two phases. That is, one phase is till 1978, another phase, so one phase is 1950 to 1978, another phase is after 1978 to 2020. These are all the two phases where we can divide here. If you could note, in these two phases the fertility rate fell by 17% in this gap where we were following the forced sterilization technique. So forced sterilization means Kattaya Kudumba Kattupada operation, or forced family planning operations, or coercive technique. Government was forcing people to restrict the children to 2, and there were coercive techniques. So in this time our population fell only by 17%. But after 1978, if you could note, till 2000, if you could note, the fertility fell by, till 2015, if you could note, the fertility fell by 35%. So how there is a drastic increase in fall of fertility? Because in this period the government was following the voluntary model. That is, they left the number of children to be decided to people itself. You itself decide how many ever children you want. Like that, they left it voluntarily to the people, and because of allowing the people to choose voluntarily, the rate of fall was higher. So this is what the trend she is discussing here. So if you leave it to people to decide how many ever children they want, if you make it voluntary, then the population fall will be higher. With the forced sterilization and massive family planning drive, there was only 17% reduction in the earlier phase. But in 1994 to 2015 saw a reduction of 3.4 to 2.2, that is 35% fall. So this fall is mainly because of shifting from coercion based family planning methods to voluntary based family planning methods. Okay, so there was this conference called Cairo Conference on population and development, which was organized by United Nations. After this Cairo conference only, it was decided that the population control policy should be voluntary. Like in China, they are having this forced policy of one child norm, but we should not have such forced norms. We should have the voluntary policy. Only if it is voluntary, it is good for the people. That is what it was discussed in Cairo, and that was followed by Indian government, and that led to this drastic fall. But if you could note in detail, there is another reason why the population fell, because of this aspirational revolution. What is this aspirational revolution? Post 1990, we had a tremendous socio-economic transition because of this 1991 economic reforms and further globalization. Because of this globalization, what is happening? There is a socio-economic transformation in the society, and India attained development. So there is this quote also called as development is the best contraceptive. When you give people the development, the people will have less children. So that is what the norm is. So that transformed, that led to this aspirational revolution, and because of that only there is a tremendous fall. Okay, there was a decline on agriculture. When people were dominantly dependent on agriculture, they saw each and every children as the workforce in their own form. But when the nation developed and people started to find jobs in the secondary sector and tertiary sector, what is happening? In secondary sector and tertiary sector, only skill matters. Okay, so what they decided, instead of having more children, they decided to have less children and spend more on schooling and education. So this increased schooling and college enrollment made people to spend more money on education. Since people were spending more money on education, they cannot have 6 or 7 kids, because for each and every kid they have to spend a lot for education and college and for skill development. So instead of spending more money on more people, what the families decided, they decided to have less number of children. Let us have 2 children, or let us have one child, and let us spend all the money we have, and we will provide the best quality education to them. So because of this schooling and college enrollment transformation and socio-economic transformation and decline of agriculture, an aspirational revolution came, and that led to reduction in number of kids. And next, if you could see in the Western nation, there was fall in the fertility after development because of retreat in family. Retreat in family means the Western nations saw that after they achieved the development, what they did, they retreated from family. They were averse of the family life, and they didn't want the family life, so they didn't have children. But in India, with the development, the commitment to the family increased. So what is happening in India? India didn't develop this retreat in family. Instead, in India, in the Eastern nation, what happens? Commitment of the mother and father to their children increased, and they decided to have less number of children and more commitment. So that is how the transformation took place in India. So that led to the fertility fall. So that is how the India's fertility changed, and this is going to continue in future. And I'm sure this aspirational revolution is going to continue in future. That is what the author is telling, even after 2050 also. With this aspirational revolution in the background, what we have to do, what the government should do means, government should develop the better health and family welfare, provide good health and family welfare for the people, provide sex education. We are not even providing the sex education for the children. We have to provide the proper sex education, and then reproductive health services like providing condoms, and by increasing the availability of the contraceptive pills and by increasing the availability of the condoms, you have to provide more sexual and reproductive health to the citizens, and we have to make it voluntary. Allow the individuals to decide how many ever children they want. Let us make it voluntary. By just leaving it to their own, by allowing it to be voluntary, this aspirational revolution itself will reduce the fertility, and government no need to worry about controlling the population. So that is what the way forward is. Develop health and family welfare, provide sexual and reproductive health and sex education, and make the population policy voluntary. So the next editorial is about how the tiger can regain its stripes. So it is about tiger conservation. Recently we just celebrated the Global Tiger Day, International Tiger Day on July 29. In this article, the author, that is Mr. Ullas Karanth. Ullas Karanth is a director of Center for Wildlife Studies. It is an NGO which is focusing on environmental conservation and tiger protection. So he is writing this article. In this article, what he is telling, he is talking about the present dichotomy in the tiger conservation, whether how to proceed further in tiger conservation. That is about that he is talking, and also he is discussing on how the tiger conservation got diluted over the period of time. In 1970s, we started this tiger conservation with full vigor, but it got diluted over the period of time. How it got diluted, that he is discussing. And finally, he is giving the way forward of how to bring back the tiger conservation to the fullest effort. So this is a very important article with respect to tiger conservation. Tiger is our national animal, and Project Tiger is one of the most successful and celebrated model of conservation of tiger. India also achieved the target of doubling the tiger's population according to the St. Petersburg Declaration also. So India's Project Tiger is a very successful one, but still he is finding the flaws in that. So if there is a question, so there can be a potential question in the GS3 mains, because in GS3 there is this word called conservation. So it is about tiger conservation, so it is directly related to GS3, and there can also be a question which asks about the success of Project Tiger, or critically analyze the Project Tiger. If such a question is being asked, we know the positive aspects of Project Tiger and we would have discussed, but this article talks about few problems in the Project Tiger which the India's forest and department and bureaucracy is facing, and let us discuss about that problems, because we need the negative aspects also while writing the answer, and this provides a good critical analysis of the India's tiger conservation. So tiger conservation needs a reboot to match the scale of India's aspirations. So he starts the article with a dichotomy. Okay, what is the dichotomy is that, so presently earlier in 2014 our tiger population was 2226. Now in 2018 our tiger population reached 2937 roughly. So this is the present situation. But what the environmentalists are telling, with the available land in India, with the available forest land in India, what we can go is we can maximum try to have this 3500. Like, see, earlier there were large tract of forest land. In that large tract of forest land, we had the potential to house almost 10,000 to 15,000 tigers. Now, because of this urbanization and development which we are facing, and conversion of the forest land for agriculture, what happened? This forest tract generally declined. This tiger habitat generally declined, and it is having the present capacity of only 3500. So now we are having the dichotomy whether to increase this number to 3500 and stop there, or because this is the present land now, or we have to take it back to the earlier condition of 1950 levels. In 1950 we had the capacity of 10,000 15,000 tigers. Now we are just having for 3000 tiger. Either we have to stop our Project Tiger at 3500 or revive back all the lost lands, because if we are aiming at reviving back the lost land, what will happen? With the urbanization on one side, and with the developmental aspirations, and with the increased demand for land, because of increasing population, there will be increasing in demand for the secondary and tertiary sector and primary sector for land, because for primary, secondary, tertiary sector to happen, to do the business, we need the land as basic factors of production. So there will be demand for land, and there is a population increase also. So with these problems in between, whether we can aspire for taking back to this. So this is the dichotomy, and we have to choose the proper one. But this author is suggesting to go back to this because he is an environmentalist. That is the first point which the author is mentioning. So we can know this dichotomy. Whenever we are talking about the environmental issue, we can talk about this dichotomy and policy making, whether to stop in 3500 or go for 15,000. So that is one thing. So ups and downs of tiger conservation in India is the second point which is discussing over the period of time. In the 1972 only, we brought in this environmental protection into our constitutional framework, and environmental protection consciousness increased only after this 1972 with the leadership of Indira Gandhi. That is what he is mentioning in the article. We passed this Wildlife Protection Act in 1972 and Forest Conservation Act in 1980, and we also brought in the fundamental duties to protect the environment, and we also brought in a DPSP. So Article 48A, which talks about protection of environment, and Fundamental Rights 51A. These two articles were brought in the Constitution itself for protecting environment. So ever since that, India's environmental protection framework got a fillip because of the strong political leadership, and this political leadership provided the political will and the efforts, field level efforts of the forest officials and NGO. So then government allowed the collaboration between the forest officials and NGO for the conservation of environment, and environment was focused a lot. So ever since 2000 onwards, what is happening? At one side, the economic development is peaking because of this 1991 reforms, and then followed by the economic development, and at the same time globalization and global collaboration. This globalization and global collaboration for the protection of the forest and nature is also increasing. So there is an interference from the international organization with respect to environmental protection, and also our bureaucracy. So this IFS, Indian Forest Service, was a field work based organization which was focusing on enforcing the forest law and forest protection law on the field. So it was mostly a field work based organization, but after 2000 it is becoming into a multitasking organization like IAS. So it is getting various other multitask because of this global interventions and because of the globalization, and the work nature of the IFS is becoming very complicated. So that is one of the main problem after 2000, which is what the author is discussing. So after 2000, Global Environment Facilities and World Bank, so they both got interfered in the India's environmental protection, and they brought in this eco development model. This eco development, see, there are two models for environment protection. If this is a sensitive region in the environment, we should not bring in any development here, and this forest should be left alone. This is one way. On another side is, if this is the sensitive area or the forest area, if we want development, we can bring in development, but the development should be regulated. Okay, that development should be sustainable. So this model totally prohibits the development in and around the forest area, but this model allows the regulated intervention of development in and around the forest area. And it talks about sustainable development. We can do development, the development should be sustainable. That is what it talks. So it is a balanced one. So this is called as eco development model. This eco development model was brought in by this World Bank and Global Environmental Facility. Ever since the sustainable eco development model started to come in, the complete protection of the pristine forest started to fall. So this is one criticism which he is telling. Because it is started falling, that's why the region which was capable of 15,000 tigers is reduced to 3,500 tigers. Why it has reduced? Because of this eco development model only. This author is going to one extreme step and telling that we should allow the forest ecosystem to be pristine without any disturbance. So that is one thing which he is. Next, in 2006 we brought in this Forest Rights Act. In the Forest Rights Act, what we did, we provided the land rights for the forest dwellers or various tribal people. We provided them the forest rights. So this Forest Rights Act, over the period of time, it has created a lot of intervention by the outsiders in the name of forest dwellers. They are also coming and entering the forest and taking away the pristine nature of the forest. So that is one criticism of Forest Rights Act. So conflict of forest dwellers with the conservation effect. So whenever the environmentalists go in for conservation, these forest dwellers are protecting and asking the environmentalists to go out. That is one problem which is happening. Next, so in 2005 there was a turning point where the Tiger Task Force were created. This Tiger Task Force was created when Sariska Tiger Reserve. There is this Tiger Reserve called Sariska Tiger Reserve in Rajasthan. In this Tiger Reserve, we had a lot of tigers, but these tigers got extinct in 2005. No tigers was surviving there. So after this tiger conservation got into the political consciousness, and government formed this Tiger Task Force. So this Tiger Task Force, what they did, instead of focusing on recovering of the larger potential tracks and aiming for this 10,000 to 15,000, they got restricted to 3,500 model. That is, they focused only on few tiger reserve. They decided to name a few areas called few areas as tiger reserve and conserve only that. Instead of focusing on the reclaiming the entire tiger area of 1950 level, they were just focusing on the those regions wherever the tiger is present at the present time, and they focused on the conservation effect of only that. So they restricted their ambit to few reserves and spent the money ambitiously and heavily there by neglecting the large tracts of land. So that is another turning point where they turned from this 15,000 model to 3,000 model. So that was in 2005. And next, this tiger conservation effect is being dominated by government bureaucracy and government officials. They are taking everything in their hand and they are not allowing the NGOs to participate. Since all the tiger census and tiger conservation is being done only by the government, what is happening? There is no data transparency. Government is not being transparent with respect to data, and independent audit also. Government told that 2226 tigers became 2,937. But whether these numbers are reliable, whether the independent audit was taken, so that is a very big question mark. So government is not allowing the private players to participate and NGOs to participate in the tiger conservation, and it is dominated by government bureaucracy. And finally, government created this National Tiger Conservation Authority in 2010 with the aim of protecting the tigers. This Tiger Conservation Authority was initially aimed at protection of tigers only, but over the period of time its objective got bloated up. So its responsibilities increased and it brought into its ambit snow leopards and cheetahs also. So since its objectives are increasing in everyday day-to-day activities, its focus on tiger conservation is declining. That is another complaint which he is mentioning. So we can write all these points as criticism for India's Project Tiger when the question is being asked. And finally, he is giving the way forward also. So what he is telling at the end, the forest bureaucracy should focus only on the forest law enforcement and field work, and they should not be doing multitasking like IAS. Okay, they should revert back to field work. That is one thing he is telling. And another thing is what he is suggesting it, we should remove the monopoly of government. The government should remove its monopoly in tiger conservation, and it should allow the NGOs and private players also to participate. And then National Tiger Conservation Authorities objectives should be reduced. That is one thing. And he is asking us to focus from 3500 model to 15,000 tigers model. So that is what he is telling in the conclusion. So final article of the day is about the self-reliant foreign policy. So it is about the India's foreign policy and directly related in GS2. We are having international relations in syllabus, so it is directly related to syllabus. And this talks about how India should develop its foreign policy in the present times. In the present times, we are having a Cold War kind of a situation between USA and China. Since USA and China is having a Cold War kind of a situation now, how India have to make its foreign policy now? When USA and USSR had a Cold War, India brought in its policy called non-aligned movement. This non-aligned movement means India will neither align with USA nor with USSR. India will stay independent, and India will not be dependent on any other nation for its foreign policy. India will stay independent and make its own foreign policy and maintain strategic autonomy. So strategic autonomy was the main theme of the USA-USSR. And now India, when there is a Cold War emerging between USA and China, we should also follow the same strategic autonomy. So how we can follow the strategic autonomy? That is only this article is talking about. So in a multipolar world order, self-reliance means having variable combination of like-minded power. So recently Prime Minister talked about Atmanirbhar. So what the author is telling that this Atmanirbhar should be there even in the foreign policy also. So the Atmanirbhar in foreign policy is called as strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy or self-reliant foreign policy. So we have to make our own foreign policy and we have to bring in this strategic autonomy. This Atmanirbhar should extend to foreign policy also. That is what the author is arguing for. So self-reliance in foreign policy means strategic autonomy. That is being independent without any external pressure while making a foreign policy decision. Whenever we are making a foreign policy decision, we should make with India's interest in mind or global interest in mind. Okay, we should make our own decision in our own discretion, and we should not be forced externally. This external force should not be there. Without any external force, India should make a policy decision with India's interest and global interest in mind with its own discretion by being independent without external pressure. So that is what strategic autonomy means. Okay, but at the same time, the strategic autonomy cannot be always the only way forward. In the moment of crisis, whenever India is facing the problem, we can have certain flexibility with respect to strategic autonomy also. For that, author is showing the various instances in the history where India showed the flexibility within the strategic autonomy when they were making the foreign policy. Like for example, in 1962, when India-China war was going on, India went and asked for the US help. Then Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first Prime Minister who brought in this concept of non-aligned movement and strategic autonomy. He itself went and asked the help from USA because USSR was neglecting help, and he went and asked the help from USA, and during the crisis he showed the flexibility of asking help. So that is one thing. In 1971 war also, what we did, India went and signed a peace, friendship and cooperation treaty with USSR because US might support Pakistan. That is what India predicted, and India went and signed the treaty. So when there is a crisis, India went and aligned with a nation. So we can show the flexibility in case of crisis. In 1999 Kargil war also, India allowed the USA to pressurize Pakistan to go back. Only after USA pressurized Pakistan strongly to revert back, and Indian Air Force also was performing well, that led to the setback for Pakistan in the Kargil war. So India allowed USA to interfere in the Kargil war and pressurized Pakistan to go back. What the author is telling, in the previous instances, whenever we had a crisis, we showed the flexibility. Now similarly, we are having a crisis now. What is the crisis we are having? We are having crisis from China. China in the border is trying to change the landscape, and it is trying to show the dominance in the South Asian region. In this time of crisis, and at the parallelly, China is also having a Cold War with USA. China is creating problem to us, it is having Cold War with USA. At this time, what we can do, in order to check China, we can have a flexibility in our strategic autonomy and align with USA also. That is what the author is asking here. But aligning with USA should not be at the cost of India's independence. So that is one thing. So even though the geopolitical circumstances compelled India to ask help from the foreign nations, India just went and asked help, but it doesn't become less autonomous. India asked help for its own benefits only. So without becoming less autonomous, we have to play the game. Rather, India secured its sovereignty and freedom and territorial integrity by maneuvering the great political powers. So, we have to protect our freedom, sovereignty and integrity. At the same time, we can also show some flexibility. Like that only our foreign policy should be there. So, whenever the question is being asked, we can show this example and we can also write about strategic autonomy. Today, with the growing tensions with the China line of actual control on one side and building Cold War between USA and China on other side, full non-alignment makes little sense. So, India can now align with the USA slightly. So what the author is telling, at this time India can have this proverbial support cake. So what is this proverbial support cake means? In order to check China, we can align with USA. At the same time, we have to build the cooperation with low and middle powers of Asia. India should avoid placing all the eggs in the USA's basket. Instead of going in only with the USA, what he is telling, he is talking about the multi-vector model. So that is the next point. Multi-vector model means India should not only dependent on USA. Depending only on USA and leaving all the nations will make India US ally. Instead, India should take help little from USA. At the same time, it should also cooperate with Iran, because going only with USA might irritate Iran and Russia also, who are also enemies of USA. So we have to cooperate with Iran also. We have to cooperate with Israel also. At the same time, we have to cooperate with the local people like Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So like this, India's alliance should be a multi-vector model instead of having a single India-USA alliance. Diversification is essence of self-reliance, a wide basket of strategic powers with variable combination. With variable combination means India and Iran is one combination where we can focus on oil. Okay, India and Saudi can also be cooperating for the investment. Saudi is ready to do a lot of investments in India. India and Israel can cooperate for defense. But if you could note, Saudi Arabia, Israel and Iran are all three are mutually against each other. Israel and Saudi Arabia have issue, Israel and Iran is having issue, Iran and Saudi Arabia are having issue. Even though these three people are enemy, India should collaborate with all the three with its own combination. Okay, diversification is the essence of self-reliance. This is what self-reliance is. We should collaborate with all with our own needs. At the same time, we should also take help from USA. This is multi-vector foreign policy. So we have to move towards multi-vector foreign policies only. The author is suggesting at the end. So note down just a keyword like multi-vector foreign policy. Diversification is essence of self-reliance. India must avoid placing all its eggs in USA's basket. So such idioms also you can use in our answers. It will be improving your answers. This is the final editorial of the day. So we have come to the end of this video. So this is the fourth video in the 5 editorials of the week series. It's been a month since we have started it. At the end of the month, what we have to do, we have to revise the points whatever discussed in the past 1 month. So you see all the videos again and revise all the points which we discussed and do this constant revision after every month. Thank you.